Hey everyone, welcome to the OklaRoots YouTube channel. In today's tutorial, we are going to make an adorable, I guess it's like a tote bag. It's a tote bag, but it is probably the most unique tote bag I have ever made. Today, we're gonna make the compass bag, and this pattern comes to us from Noodlehead. This is a somewhat deceptive bag, in my opinion. It kind of has a look that maybe is kind of basic, maybe it's kind of a simple bag, but there's actually a lot going on, and it is the most unique tote bag that I've made. The construction of this will kind of blow you away. So I want to show you, on this bag, we have a front panel and we have a back panel. However, we build this in 4 panels, and we actually build the corners and then put it all together. It's really neat. You're actually like building the sides of the bag throughout the pattern, and then you put it together, and then the sides of those make the front and the back. I'm gonna walk you through it. I'm gonna hold your hand. I'm gonna tell you every little place where things go, so don't even worry about that. But look at this. Look at these pockets. Let me just flip this up. I know the wax canvas is beautiful, but it makes it hard to see. Look at this pocket. It is a cargo side pocket with a flap, and it is very big. Perfect for a phone. And you have 2 of them. You have one on each side. If you don't think you're up for the challenge of a cargo pocket, you don't have to do that. The pattern does have an option for a slip pocket to make it a lot easier. This pattern actually comes in 2 sizes, a large and a small. This is the small, which I think is a great everyday size. I mean, look at it, how it hangs on my shoulder. Like, this is a really good everyday bag size. So on the outside, we just have the main panels with the 2 cargo pockets on the sides. On the top, we have a magnetic snap closure. And then on the inside, we have a zipper pocket and slip pocket. It's kind of hard to show you, but there's a slip pocket over the zipper pocket. It is pretty simple, but it comes together in a really fun way. I'm having a little bit of fun with the strap here. You can make an adjustable strap if you like. However, I decided to keep this just a fixed length with a little leather and wax canvas. If you love the material that I'm using on this bag, it all comes from the Bag Making Bee box for October. So if you're a member of that subscription box, you're gonna get everything you need to make this bag. I will tell you, there are a lot of bigger cuts for this bag, so I am gonna give you cut guides later in the tutorial. So if you haven't started cutting it, I would suggest waiting, because I was very specific with how I laid it all out on the material to make sure I could make it just like this. So if you're interested in the Bag Making Bee subscription box, I'll have a link down below that kind of goes over how it works. We have a couple different subscription boxes. This is for more of a confident beginner, intermediate sewer. If you're a beginner and you're like, I'm not sure I'm ready for wax canvas, waterproof canvas, these thick seams, then we have a beginner box as well. They'll both be linked down in the description of this video. Thank you as always to the Bag Making Bee Club for sponsoring today's video. Also, thank you as always to Noodlehead for allowing me to use your patterns on my channel. I have loved Noodlehead forever. I know I say this in every single one of the videos, but seriously, before I ever started making bags, I was buying patterns from Noodlehead. If you're new to the OklaRoots YouTube channel, please consider clicking subscribe down below. If at any point you like this video, please give it a like. Any questions, comments, shoutouts, any other patterns from Noodlehead you want to see, leave them down in the comment section. I've done, I think, most of them. I think I've gone through most Noodlehead patterns, but I'm sure there's a few that I haven't done, so if there's one you'd like to see, leave it down in the comments below. Alright guys, let's get started. Alright, so here's pretty much most of what we're using for today's bag. For your exterior material for the size small, which is what I'm making, you're gonna need about a ½ yard. We're gonna be using wax canvas. I just love using wax canvas with Noodlehead patterns. I feel like she uses wax canvas a lot on her display photos, and they're just so good. Noodlehead patterns are very gender neutral, and they're so classic, but also really accessible to everybody. And so wax canvas is just one of those materials that's the same way. It's like a classic material. It has, it looks better the more you wear it, the more it's kind of mushed around and things. It gives itself a really beautiful, unique texture and look. And so I love wax canvas with this. For your lining, you're going to want about 1 yard of material. Now keep in mind that the yardage in the pattern is based off of a typical yard of quilt cotton, which is 44 inches wide and 36 inches tall. If you're working with something like water resistant canvas, that is usually sold in different sizes. So while 36 inches tall is still the same, the width is closer, can be closer to 50 to 60 inches. So if you're wondering, like, well, do I need a full yard of water resistant canvas for this? You could get away with a ½ yard if you're using really wide materials. So the pattern also suggests a 1/2 yard of exterior accent material. That would be for like the side pockets, for the strap, things like that. I'm using the just one color for everything, so I don't have accent material. The only little piece of accent I have is this strip of vinyl. Now you could use this on its own as the strap. This is not an adjustable strap, it's just a shoulder bag. I'm actually gonna combine it with the wax canvas to create kind of like a fun two-tone strap. You could also use the water-resistant canvas and create a strap. You have a lot of options here. I will say that if you're using the B box, you need to be mindful of your cuts because you will have just enough material for this bag. So I am going to give you a cut diagram in just a minute, but you could use the wax canvas and the water-resistant canvas together to create a strap, or you can do what I'm doing where I'm gonna combine this piece of vinyl or leather with the wax canvas. Then you're gonna need a magnetic snap. You're gonna need 2 1-inch wide D-rings and 2 1-inch wide swivel hooks. I'm gonna be using 6 rivets today, but really the number of rivets you're using depends on quite a few different things. It depends on what kind of pockets you're gonna be making on the exterior. It depends how many rivets you wanna use for the strap. So if you have the B box, I think you have about 8 rivets. I'm gonna tell you where you can add them and change them. This is a pattern that has different pocket options, so you could use more or less a lot of these things depending on which way you want to go. Then I have my metal bag tag for OklaRoots, and then we have the awesome bag tag that was custom made by Heartwood and Hide. And then finally I have my zipper with zipper pull. I'm using a number 5 zipper. This one is about 8 inches long. So here are most of the tools I'll be using today because I am doing rivets. I have my rivet press and my hole punch. These are my 3 favorite tapes right now. I have 2 double-sided tapes. One is a 1/4 inch wide, one is an 1/8 of an inch wide. These are not leather tapes. They're not super sticky. They are wash away tapes, so they're easy to sew over. And then I'm also using this 3M transport tape, and I'm only using this because I don't have any of my paper tape here in my studio, but we do use the paper tape from Kimberbell often as well. Then I have a seam ripper and a lighter, 2 marking tools, a silver ink pen and an air erasing marker, a turning wand, and a 1-inch by 6-inch ruler. And then for my thread, I am going to be using a Tex 45 weight thread, and this is color Ube from Wizardry Stitchery. In the bobbin, I'm going to be using a Mara 100 weight thread, and my needle, as always, is a Microtex 8012. I did not find that I needed to up my needle size at all for this, but it's always good to have a Microtex 9014 or a jeans needle on hand as well. So now let's go through our pattern pieces. These are going to be your main pattern pieces, and again, this is for size small. You're going to have 4 cuts of exterior, 2 and 2 reversed. So you see, let me just show you 2 of these. If I lay them like this, they're mirror images of one another. So with wax canvas, there's really not a right and wrong side. So you can kind of cut these however you want. But if you have a regular material that has a front and a back, you need to make sure that you're cutting 2 like this and 2 like this, mirrored with one another. Same thing with the lining. You're going to have 4 cuts, 2 and 2, just like before, 2 mirrored. So this one you can see it's more, that's a wrong side and a right side. It's really cool how this comes together. Like you think you know where the center is going to be, but it's actually not there. It's pretty neat. Well, I'll show you. Next up are the base panels. You're going to have 1 cut of exterior and 1 cut of lining. So like I mentioned, there's a couple different pocket options here. You could just do what I would consider the easier option, which is a couple of slip pockets. That's going to be called View A, and you're going to use the pattern piece for that. So it's kind of like just these bottom rectangles here, but they're a little bit smaller. And then you're just going to make slip pockets on the side of the bag, and it looks amazing, and you'll use some rivets for that. But if you want to get a little fancy and do the pockets that I really like, we're going to do View B, which are cargo pockets, which means these are actually pleated pockets with a flap. It's so cool. So I highly suggest, if you're not quite sure if you want to do that or not, just watch the video and I'll show you, what could be challenging and what is a lot easier than you think it's going to be. If you were in a rush and you want to do the quicker option, I would say that the other option is probably faster. But for the cargo pockets, I have 2 cuts of exterior, because I have 2 pockets, and 2 cuts of lining. These are for the flaps, and then 2 cuts of exterior and 2 cuts of lining for the pocket part. So now for the lining pockets, you're going to have 2 cuts of your lining for a slip pocket, and then you're going to have 1 larger cut of your lining for the zipper pocket. Okay, and here's our last bits. Like I said in the beginning, we have a long piece of leather for the strap. You could just leave this as is, or you can zhuzh it up a bit, which is what I'm gonna do. So I have another cut of my wax canvas here. This cut of wax canvas is 2 inches wide and 19 inches long. It is shorter than my cut of leather, and that was intentional. I didn't want too much bulk. So I'll show you how I build this. You can kind of decide if that's something you're interested in. You could also use the water resistant canvas, which I think would be really cool. And it would probably be a lot easier to work with because this can get a little bulky. And then we have our D-ring holders and our strap tabs. Now the D-ring holders are what they say they are. They're gonna wrap around the D-ring. I adjusted the size of this a little bit. I cut 2 pieces of lining because the wax canvas can get pretty thick with this part. So I'm using the lining material, and each one of these rectangles is 2 inches by 3 inches. And then for the strap tabs, I am using the wax canvas. However, if you want to use the lining material here, you can. Again, this can be kind of bulky, but I really like the look of these two together. Now I'm gonna put up on the screen a cut guide for the wax canvas. With all these patterns, I always suggest you trace out the pattern pieces before you cut anything. Trace them all out on your material and then cut. And when you're tracing things out, you always trace out the longest and largest pieces first. You can fit in the smaller things in the spaces between them, but if you trace out the smaller items first and they're all over the place, you're not gonna be able to find room for the larger pieces. So I always start with like straps and then like the largest main panels, and then I just slowly, I go from largest to smallest, trace out all of my pattern pieces, make sure it all fits and I'm happy with it, and then I cut after everything is traced out. Same thing with the lining, trace it all out, make sure you have everything the way you want it, and then slowly cut everything out. That's my tip. But if you need help seeing how to place this to make sure you have enough material for everything, I hope that those help. So let's start with the strap. So for the strap, I have my piece of leather, I have my piece of wax canvas, I have 4 rivets, and my 2 1-inch wide swivel hooks. This is not an adjustable strap. If you have your own webbing and you want to make an adjustable strap, I think that would be a great idea. I will say this is a shorter strap, so if you want to make a longer version, then I would suggest using some other material to create a longer version. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my wax canvas here. So what I did is I just took the pointy part of a seam ripper and I traced right along the midpoint here using a ruler. So this is the wrong side of my wax canvas. And now I'm going to take the long edges and I'm going to fold them back to meet that middle line and just press. With wax canvas, you should note that you really don't have to use like tape or anything. With folding it, it just kind of holds its shape pretty well. So once you have one side folded back, repeat with the other. So now once I have those both folded back, I'm gonna grab my little piece of leather here. I'm gonna flip it wrong side up. And I measured in 1/2 inch on each short edge and just made a mark right in the center of that strap. I'm not sure if you can see it. The lighting is being weird today, but I have 1/2 inch marked in on the wrong side of each short edge of my leather. And now what I'm gonna do is take my wax canvas and I'm gonna lay it with the raw edge that meet in the back. I'm gonna lay it wrong side down. So right side up, wrong side down. And I'm gonna match up the short edges of my wax canvas with those 1/2 inch marks. So your wax canvas should be about 1 inch shorter than your strap. It's okay if it's not exact. I just like to have a little bit of overhang on the leather portion, so when I wrap this around the D-ring, the raw edges of my wax canvas are enclosed. So you can use tape or clips and just hold these 2 pieces together. So now I'm gonna take this to the sewing machine, and with the leather longer piece right side up, I'm gonna top stitch along all 4 edges, holding the wax canvas to the back of this, and I'm gonna top stitch at 1/8 inch seam allowance. All right, so once you have your strap sewn, now we wanna wrap it around our D-rings. So I'm gonna flip my strap so it's wax canvas side facing up, and I'm gonna mark in 2 inches from each short edge. And with wax canvas, as always, I like to just use something sharp, like a stiletto or the sharp part of a seam ripper, and you can just kind of scrape it. So now I'm gonna take a D-ring and I'm going to insert it so the hook part is on the black leather section and the back is by the wax canvas. And then I'm just gonna wrap the end of this strap end around the hook so that it meets that marked line. So you'll notice that it's pretty bulky right around that hook because you have the double folded wax canvas, you have the leather. So I like that because I feel like that provides a lot of structure and safety. And then it's a little bit thinner towards the end, so it's easier for me to work with my rivets. So for rivet placement, you can just measure in 1/4 inch from the raw edge of the leather and then 1/4 inch in from each side. That's where I like to kind of mark it. It's kind of messy though, goodness gracious. And then I'm just gonna grab my hole punch and I'm going to gently punch a hole at each of those marks. I like to punch the hole and then immediately add the rivet because it is kind of thick around that swivel hook and things try to pull out of the way, and I don't want them to. I want them to stay put. So I insert one rivet and then I go and I punch the other hole. So typically with 1-inch wide straps, I would just use one rivet, but because of the thickness around this and I really want this to stay put, I am using 2 rivets on each side. If you were just using a piece of webbing or just like one thick piece of leather here and it wasn't so bulky, you could get away with just using 1 rivet here. So I'm gonna repeat that on the other side of the strap. All right, once you're happy with how the strap looks, I love those 2 little rivets. It's so cute. Every time I do this on a 1-inch wide strap, I'm like, it's like 2 little eyeballs. Like you could just draw a little smile right here. That'd be fun. So now I'm gonna grab my rivet press and I'm just going to press down these 4 rivets. And that is how I build my little shoulder strap. If you want to do it a different way, I suggest you do. Let me know in the comments if you build yours differently though. So I'm gonna set this to the side now. So now let's work on our D-ring holders. And I'm gonna do mine a little bit different from the pattern just to keep the bulk down. So I have 2 cuts of lining here and these are both 2 inches by 3 inches. On the wrong side, I'm gonna have the 2-inch sides on the top and the bottom. And then I'm just gonna draw a midpoint line going between the 2 longer edges, just like this. So then I'm going to grab some double-sided tape and I'm going to run it right over that midpoint line. Take the paper off the tape and then fold these long edges back, wrong sides, to meet that midpoint line. Do this for both of them. So now the pattern is pretty much having you double fold this, so you fold them both back like this and then you fold it again. I feel like it gets pretty bulky and I think we're okay without that, so I'm just going to keep it like this. So the back has the 2 raw edges meeting, the front is nice and clean. Repeat that with the other D-ring tab. So now to make sure that these D-ring connectors are nice and secure, I'm going to take both of them to the sewing machine and I'm going to top stitch along both long edges at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to do another row of top stitching along both long edges of both tabs at a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So you should have 4 rows of top stitching on each tab. All right, once these are top stitched, you're going to take your D-ring and thread it on so that the straight part of the D-ring is on the back edge, and then just wrap this around the D-ring, and you can use a clip to hold the short raw edges together. Do this for the other D-ring as well. And now we can go to the sewing machine and just baste along these 2 short edges at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So now your D-rings are all prepped and ready to go. You can set them to the side. So now let's prep our strap tabs. If you find this really challenging to do with the wax canvas, then I would suggest you go grab the water resistant canvas and use that instead. So you're gonna take your strap tab and you're gonna fold it right sides together, matching up the 2 short edges. And you can clip along the short edge combo. Do this for both strap tabs. And now you're gonna sew along both of these edges at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, but leave a 1.5 inch opening in the center of each one of them. I know it's a little complicated, so you're just gonna sew a little bit on each edge. Just make sure you backstitch at the beginning and the end each time. All right, after you have that sewn, you're going to press the seam open that you just sewed like this, and then you're gonna fold the whole strap tab in half, and then you're gonna fold the whole strap tab in half so that the seam is now in the center and facing up. But get it all folded so the seam is running right along the center on the top. And I like to add a couple clips on the 2 short raw edges. So repeat this with your other strap tab. So now we're gonna take these to the sewing machine and we're gonna sew along the 2 short clipped edges at a 1/2 inch seam allowance on both tabs, backstitch at the beginning and the end. Now once you have those sides sewn, we're going to cut those seams in half, so it's about a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance now. And you might want to also cut down the corners just a little bit. Don't cut too close to the stitching because you don't want to accidentally cut that. But we want to get this as easy to work with as possible. So just cut the seam in half and then shaving down the corners for both of these tabs. So now we need to flip this right side out. So you're going to find that little opening that you made on that seam going right along the center, and you're gonna carefully just flip this right side out. Now this is a little tricky. Depending on your material, I would not suggest this with vinyl or anything like that. Wax canvas can do it. Just remember with wax canvas, it's like the warmer you get it, the easier it is to work with. So the more you kind of push it and mess with it, it'll be less stiff. But I also like to make sure I always have some sort of a turning tool and just really poke it in those corners. Once you get it started, it'll get a lot easier. It's just the first bit's a little challenging. So you see, as you gently work this out, now you have, it's like a little pillow with a little opening on the back. You can just kind of tuck in those edges and you have this nice little square. So take your time here to really push out the seams. If you're using a material that can be ironed, which is not wax canvas, if you're using like a quilt cotton or something, you can go ahead and iron that. I would say this is pretty bulky, so I would make sure you use nothing thicker than wax canvas for this. So repeat this with your other strap tab. All right, once you have them both turned out and squared up as much as possible, you can set these to the side. So now let's work on the cargo pockets, which are so cool. So you're gonna grab your flaps, we'll start with those. Grab one exterior and one lining flap, and you're going to lay these right sides together. And we're gonna focus on the sides and the rounded main bottom. So we're gonna clip along all the edges except the top straight edge. And now we're gonna sew along the sides and the rounded bottom, all at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and the end. And you're gonna do this for both of your flaps. So once you have that sewn, we're gonna trim the seam allowance in half. If you have pinking shears, that's a great tool to use for this, because it kind of does 2 steps in one, but I don't, so we're gonna do 2 steps. So once you have the seam allowance trimmed in half, then we're gonna go back up to the top corners here, and we're just gonna kind of shave down the top corners. So it's not like a sharp cut from the thread over. It's like I'm a little bit above the thread, like 1/8 of an inch away from it, and then just kind of shave it down like a tall, skinny triangle. And then around these corners and the curve, I'm just gonna cut into the seam allowance, cutting fairly close to my stitching, but I'm not actually like cutting up to the stitching, because we want this to be smooth when we turn it right side out. And by cutting into the seam allowance like this, it's gonna allow the material to kind of spread over itself so it can create a nice smooth corner. It's not gonna be fighting to stay straight. So all the way around the bottom, paying particular attention to those corners. So repeat this with the other flap. And then once you have them trimmed, we're going to flip the flap right side out and press out that seam really well. Get it nice and smooth and rounded. We don't want any of that like jagged, like straight, sharp angle, straight, sharp angle. You know, we want it nice and smooth. So wax canvas is great because you can kind of like, it's like putty almost. You can kind of roll it and mold it. So then I'm gonna just add clips as I go around this. And I'm using clips to hold the seam in place because of my material. If you were using like a quilt cotton or something, you could just press out these seams and then iron it, and it should hold it in place. And then once I'm happy with the curved seam, I'm going to also clip along the top straight edge here that is open. So this is what my flap looks like. I'm going to repeat with the other flap. So now I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and I'm going to top stitch along the sides and the curved sewn seam, all at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. The pattern does not mention basting the top straight edge, and that is for a reason, for a later step. However, because my material has body to it and kind of thickness to it, I am going to baste along that top straight edge, but I'm going to do it at about a scant 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So like just under 1/8 of an inch, but around 1/8 of an inch. All right, once you have that top stitched and basted, I would just make sure you clean up the corners a little bit. Anywhere you have like some threads that are just kind of fraying or anything, do your best to clean it up because it'll make attaching it to the bag easier if it's not messy. Okay, you can set these to the side for a minute. So now we're gonna do the cargo pockets, and we need the template to help us with this. So we're going to lay our exterior material wrong side up, and then on the template you have these pleat marks here, and we're gonna use those to help us. So we're gonna lay this over our cargo pocket, and I just poked a hole on the bottom of each one of these vertical lines. And so all I have to do is use my marking tool of choice and kind of poke in those holes, and then I'm also going to lift up the top of the pattern piece here and just mark where the top of that line is on the top of my material. So if you were using like an air erasing marker or silver ink pen, you'll do the same thing, but because I have wax canvas, I can just use something sharp. Okay, and I doubt you can see it, but I have like a little dot and a mark, and then what I do is I just connect the dot and the mark with a straight edge and just make a little mark. So I'm gonna do that for all 4 of these bits here. So now, once you have those 4 marks made, you're gonna fold this cargo pocket right sides together, short side edges together, and you're going to match up those marks. Just gonna fold it. So when you fold it directly in half, those marks should match up. So I'm just gonna clip along the fold over here on the right, and make sure you match up the marks on the top and the bottom. So now with this wrong side out, we're going to sew right over those marked lines. So now 2 of the marked lines are sandwiched together, right? They're meeting each other on the top and the bottom. So you're gonna go from the top and you're gonna sew all the way down to the end of the marked line. Make sure you backstitch well at the beginning and the end, and then you're gonna repeat that on the bottom. Do this for both of your cargo pockets. Once you have those bits sewn, now you're going to flip this. This is wrong side up, and you're going to just push down that little bubble that you have now on that fold and flatten it out. So I'm looking at the wrong side. I'm just gonna go down the entire length of this, flattening it out. You might need to kind of put your finger in there, or you can grab your turning tool and just get in there so you can easily flatten it down. So on the back, this is what it looks like. You have like this little bump, but on the front, it just looks like this cute little crease, kind of like a little, I'm not gonna say what it looks like, but you know what I'm thinking. So repeat this with your other cargo pocket. Okay, so now flip your cargo pockets so they're right sides facing up. And you might wanna use a marking tool of some sort to help you with this part, but you wanna kind of open up the center folds and figure out where the stitching is. And then just make a little mark on the right side so you can see where the stitching starts on the inner section of this pocket. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna top stitch 1/4 of an inch away from the seam, going right along the center here, going from the top down to your mark, so just past where the stitching ends, and then over the seam, and then back up the other side at 1/4 of an inch. So you're just top stitching a little 1/4 inch rectangle around your seam, making sure that you don't go all the way up and down. You want the center to be open. So you're gonna do this for both cargo pockets. So you're gonna repeat those same steps for the lining panels of the cargo pocket, except for the top stitching. So the top stitching around the top and the bottom of those seams, you don't need to do that, but for the rest of it, you do. You just need to create that pleat and then flatten it out as best as you can. So now we're gonna grab one exterior cargo pocket and lay it right side up and the top on the top, and then grab one of your lining cargo pocket panels and lay it right side down. So we're gonna match up the midpoint pleats and the top corners. And then we're also gonna match up the bottom corners, and we're gonna clip along the top and the 2 side edges. So do this with both your cargo pockets. And now we're gonna sew along the 2 sides and the top edges, all at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitching at the beginning and the end, and make sure you keep the pleat on the top of the lining folded in place. All right, once you have these sewn, we're going to cut the corners down. So I'm just gonna go up to the corner and cut it at a 45-degree angle. And then I also just kind of cut like a gradual corner away from those. And then we're also gonna cut the bottom corners down. So cut down all 4 corners of both of your cargo pockets. Once you have those corners trimmed down, you can turn these pockets so that they are right side out. And it gets pretty bulky at the top where that pleat seam is. So this is where you gotta be a little careful. Use your turning tool and make sure you really poke out those top corners. And you get that top edge as straight as possible. So now I'm gonna finger press this top edge well. And you might want to grab a clamp or something if you have it, or even a seam roller, and just try to smush down that center top pleat, because it is very thick. I will tell you that you could probably get away with not top stitching this top edge. We're going to be top stitching the sides to the bag in a little bit, so I do believe the pocket will keep its shape just fine if you chose not to top stitch the top edge. So just give it a shot, see if you can, but if that's just too thick, then I would say you could skip that step. But you see, I'm gonna grab a seam roller here and I'm just gonna really push down on that seam. The flatter I can get it, the easier it'll be for my sewing machine. So I'm gonna repeat this with the other pocket. Okay, so now I'm gonna take this to the sewing machine and I'm going to top stitch along this top edge at an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitching at the beginning and the end of each pocket. You might wanna up your needle here to a jeans needle or to a Microtex 9014. just take your time here. So you might have noticed I used a ruler to help me get over those thick seams in the center, because a lot of times it's not really the thickness of the material that gives the machine trouble. It's going from thin material to thick material really quickly that the tension doesn't work well with that. And so what you can do is you can just use an acrylic ruler. It's like the perfect height, and you can just tuck it in behind your presser foot, so behind the needle. So underneath the presser foot, behind the needle, and you can just slowly keep it there while it's going from thin up to thick, and you'll notice that you shouldn't have skipped stitches, you shouldn't have needles breaking. As long as you're going slow, it should help. So that's a trick that I use all the time, because, you know, the thickness is not difficult for the machine. It's just going from thin to thick really quickly. Okay, you can set these 2 pockets to the side. So now grab your exterior main panels and take 2 sets that are mirroring one another, and we're going to fold them right sides together, and we're specifically looking on the longer side edge. So it's the taller edge. Line it up corner to corner, edge to edge, and use some clips to hold this in place. So repeat this with your other exterior combo. And now we're going to sew along both of these long clipped edges at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, backstitch at the beginning and the end. Once you have those sewn, we're going to press the seam allowance open. So this is easiest to do from the back. Just give it a good press with your fingers. If you already have your seam roller out, you can use this. This is actually really great on wax canvas. And then we flip it open. You see we have a nice seam going down the center. Do this for the other panel. So now we're going to take these to the sewing machine, and we're going to top stitch along both edges of the seam, holding those seams open on the back, and we're going to top stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance on each side of each seam of your panels. Okay, so these seams actually end up being the side of the bag. The front and the back is going to be the other edge. So it's kind of interesting. So we're going to be building the pockets onto the side of these seams now. So now grab one of your cargo pockets or slip pocket if you're not making the cargo pocket. Like I said, the slip pocket is much easier. It's very similar to this, except you just didn't have to deal with all the middle, seam and the bulk on the top and everything in the flap. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our cargo pocket and we're going to line it up, seam centered on the seam on the bottom of our main panels here, and clip those bottom edges down. Raw edge to raw edge, centered on the bottom. Press the side seams really well. And what we want to do is we want to top stitch the side seams and the bottom edges all at an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. When you're top stitching these top corners here, if you're going to use rivets, that's totally fine. But if you're not going to use rivets, you're going to want to do the triangle method. The pattern has a good diagram for this. But pretty much, I'm just going to start about 1/2 of an inch down from one of the corners. And I'm going to top stitch up to the top stitching on the top part of my pocket, over to the corner, back down the side edge, down the raw edge, up the other side edge, and then I'm going to make another little triangle like that. I am going to backstitch at the beginning and the end as well. Now, I like to leave the threads nice and long, even though I did backstitch, because the whole point of the corner triangle and the backstitching, everything, is to really reinforce this corners, because when you're tugging on this, that's where you're going to get a lot of pressure, right? So I'm going to flip this over and I'm going to pull on the bobbin thread on the back here, so I can just get the top thread tugged up and to the back side of my material. So all my threads now are on the wrong side of my main panels. And then I'm just going to tie them in a knot to secure them. Okay, so now that that's done, we want to work on the flap. So for the flap, I want to mark the midpoint on the straight edge. So I'm just going to fold this in half. And I'm going to use my little sharp edge here to mark the midpoint. You could use an air erasing marker or chalk or whatever. And then we're going to grab a ruler and we're going to measure 1 inch up from the top edge of our cargo pocket. And then we're going to take our flap and we're going to lay it right side down. Match up the midpoint mark with the seam going down the middle, and the bottom straight edge, we have it lining side up, bottom straight edge is 1 inch above your top of your cargo pocket. Now, if you're having a hard time keeping everything together because wax canvas doesn't hold tape and stuff very well, don't forget that using a sharp tool marks on wax canvas really well. So with the main panel right side up, I just drew this little horizontal line, which is 1 inch above the top of my pocket. and then I can lay my flap over it and just make sure that the bottom straight edge of my flap matches up with that horizontal line. And now we're going to stitch down along this straight edge on the bottom of our flap at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Backstitch really well at the beginning and the end. Make sure it stays straight and 1 inch above the pocket. So once again, I left those threads long and I'm going to pull them onto the back side and knot them. Okay, before you move on, clean up any little thready bits you might have. So just make sure everything is nice and tidy. And then you're gonna fold the flap down. So it's exterior side up now. Fold it down. It should cover the top edge of your cargo pocket. Doesn't that look so cool? I think it looks so cool. And now what we're gonna do is we're gonna top stitch over that folded top of the flap at 1/4 inch seam allowance. So you should be enclosing the raw edge of the flap here. We're sewing past that. So all that raw edge bit will be tucked in really nicely. We're gonna top stitch along this top edge at 1/4 inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and the end really well, and make sure you also pull the threads to the back and tie them off. And isn't that neat? So this is the side pocket on the bag. In the end, this ends up wrapping around the side, which is such a cool look. I know it's a few more steps and a little bit harder than the other pocket, but I think it is such a unique design on a bag that you gotta give it a try. So I'm gonna repeat that step exactly for the other panel and the other cargo pocket. I'm gonna do it off camera though. Okay, so once you have both your pockets, regardless if they're the cargo pockets or just the slip pockets installed on the sides here, now we're gonna install our D-rings. So I'm gonna measure down 2 3/8 of an inch from the top edge and just draw a little horizontal line. My measurement's a little bit different from the pattern because I adjusted the D-ring tab size. I made my tabs longer just to make them easier to sew. So what we're gonna do is we're going to lay our D-ring tab so it's D-ring hardware facing up towards the top edge, and the bottom raw edge of the tab is centered on the side seam here, right on that horizontal line. So if you wanna use tape, you can use tape. I use my marks to help me eyeball it and keep an eye on it whenever I'm at the sewing machine. So now we're gonna go to the sewing machine and we're gonna just baste the bottom raw edges of our D-ring tabs at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, holding it in place onto the bag. So after you have that basted in place, now measure down 3 1/4 of an inch from the top edge and mark another horizontal line. So it's just a little bit below my previous one. Let's see, how far is that? Yeah, for me it's like 7/8 of an inch below, which makes sense, right? All right, so now we wanna add these little strap tabs. And what I like to do before I add these is make an X on it. So I just used my seam ripper again and just traced a little X corner to corner. And what you're gonna do is you're gonna take your tab and you're going to lay it right side up so the seam is on the back, and you're gonna match up the bottom edge of this with that 3 1/4 inch mark, and it should cover most of your D-ring with just a bit coming out the top. Now, I might have more coming out the top than you do if you use the D-ring measurement in the pattern, just because my D-rings are a little bit taller, which I'm okay with. I'll make sure that the hardware doesn't get in the seam in the end, but you're gonna wanna overlay these over your D-ring tabs just like that. And now we're gonna take this to the sewing machine, and you wanna top stitch around all 4 edges of the tab, and then you also wanna top stitch an X going right through it. It does not matter if you go over some of the edges multiple times. I actually think that's a good thing. I like to go over the top horizontal edge a couple times. So I'll end up just doing a rectangle first, and then I will go do the X going over some of my other stitches a couple times. Back stitch at the beginning and the end. All right, there we go. Isn't that cute? Is it cute? It's a little bulky, but it's not as bulky as you think it might be. And I think in the end it looks really, really nice. I am gonna add a rivet through this, but I'm gonna wait until the very end because I'm gonna have the rivet go through the lining main panel as well. So now we're gonna connect these 2 main panels, and the seam I'm focused on is going to end up being the front of the bag. So I don't have a preference on what anything looks like because I don't have a print, but if you had a print, the print that's going right here in the middle, that's going to be the front of the bag. So if you're like, no, I want it over here to be the front, then just flip these around. So it doesn't matter, just if you have a preference where the front of the bag is, I'm just telling you I'm gonna be focusing on the front side of the bag now, because remember, these pockets are on the side. So I'm going to flip these 2 panels right sides together, and on the right edge over here, I'm going to clip these right sides together. And now I'm gonna sew along this clipped edge at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitching at the beginning and the end. Now, open these 2 panels up, and on the wrong side, press this seam open. I always forget I have this seam roller. And then once I use it, I'm like, why don't I use this more often? Now flip this back over so you're looking at the right side of the exterior panel, and we're going to top stitch along each side of that seam at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. All right, so the reason I was going on about this being the front is because I'm gonna attach my bag tag here, and I like to attach it kind of off to the side between the seam and between the pocket. And I am going to put my bag tag about 2 inches up from the bottom edge. We are gonna have a 1/2 inch seam allowance down here and some natural curvature of the bag, so I don't want my bag tag to get caught up in any of that. So I'm just kind of eyeballing it. I'm just centering it between the edge of the pocket and the seam. And I'm going to mark where that is. And then I'll just use my washer to help me add placement here. And so when I install metal bag tags, I always like to add a little extra oomph to the back of them. So I have a scrap piece of my wax canvas here. You could also use stabilizer if you'd like, but I'm just going to mark the same slits on this scrap as I did on my main panel for the prongs. And I'm just gonna do a dry fit real quick, where I insert my prongs into the slits on the bag. Make sure it looks good. Yes, very good. Now I like to add some Makinh 3-in-1 glue to the back of my metal bag tags. If you don't work with metal bag tags, then you can just ignore this. And I get asked all the time about where I had my custom tags made. They were manufactured in China. I have a link down in the description of this video that will take you to a post that I made that goes over in detail how I had it done and who I used and links and everything. So it is a pretty technical process, but I like them. So I'm gonna insert this into the panel just like that. Flip this over, add my scrap piece over the back, insert the prongs, and then add my washer. I'm gonna fold these prongs in on themselves, and then I'm gonna grab a piece of duct tape, and I'm just going to cover the metal with the duct tape. And there we go, cute bag tag all installed. So now let's finish building the exterior. So we're gonna take the other outer edges of our main exterior panels, and we're gonna pull them right sides together, line them up edge to edge, corner to corner, and clip these together. And now sew along this clipped edge at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitching at the beginning and the end. Okay, now this part's a little tricky. Once again, you want to press open that seam allowance, but now you have a tube. So top stitching gets a little tricky here. What I like to do is I'm gonna lay this in my sewing machine, and the one thing you gotta get in your head is that this is not going to stay tube-like. You've gotta be okay smushing it. So we're going to top stitch over each side of this seam, just like we did previously at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. But as we go, we're really smushing the rest of the bag out of the way. We're not keeping it sturdy. We're not keeping it together. I'm gonna do my best to show this on camera, but take your time with this step. It is a little challenging. So now on the back of my exterior panel, I'm gonna mark a 1/2 inch in from both the long and short edges and just make like a little square. Do this on all 4 corners. It's gonna make it easier to sew. You're not cutting any of this or anything like that. These are just sewing guidelines. So this is on the wrong side of that bottom panel. And now with the wrong side of the front of the bag facing up. So remember, the pockets are on the side. The front seam is right here in the center. I'm gonna take my base panel, I'm gonna lay it right sides together with that front panel, matching up the midpoint on the long edge of my base panel with that seam going right along the center, which is the middle of the front panel. And I'm gonna clip these right sides together. And I'm only worried about this one edge of my rectangle. So even though this is like a rounded bottom, I can straighten it out enough to line up with that straight long edge of my rectangle. And then you're gonna have to finagle the bag. So you're not gonna be able to keep it as a nice little loop. Just get this edge together. So now turn this so you're looking at the wrong side of your base panel, and we're gonna go to the sewing machine and we're gonna sew from marked line to marked line. So we're not going all the way to the edge of our base panel. We're going to that 1/2 inch mark, back stitching at the beginning, sewing along this edge at a 1/2 inch seam allowance until you get to your other 1/2 inch box over here and stop and back stitch. All right, so you see how the base panel is attached, but the very corner of it is not? That's what we want to do. So now we're going to look at the back of the bag. So looking at the back side, we're going to line up the other midpoint mark on the long edge of the base panel, right sides together with the back part of the bag, and clip in place. And remember, you're probably going to have to lift this up, mush it around. It's not going to all just be like a perfect rectangle. You're pretty much wrapping an oval around a rectangle right now. Okay, so once again, with the base panel facing wrong side up, we're going to sew along this clipped edge at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, starting and stopping at those marked corners, backstitch at the beginning and the end. Okay, so now you have the 2 long edges sewn onto the bottom of this bag. Before we sew the sides on, we need to prepare it. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the back of the main panels, and where the stitching ends on that 1/2 inch seam allowance, we're going to cut from the bottom raw edge up right to that stitching. So we're going to do this on both ends of that 1/2 inch seam allowance that's connecting the base panel. Okay, so both ends on the back and the front panels. Just find where the stitching stops and cut straight up in the seam. You're not cutting the base panel, you're only cutting all the layers of the main exterior panels. Base panel's out of the way though. I'm holding it out of the way. So you do that, so when you kind of tug at these corners here, you see how the main panel splits open like that? Can you see that? It's creating like a little triangle, which means now our oval can wrap around the rectangle. That's a bag strategy. Isn't that neat? This is nice short edge, so you really don't have to worry about marking a midpoint on the short edge of the base. You just have to pull it, and you'll notice that the main outer panel splits right around those corners. So then you can just clip this together. Base panel and main panel exteriors right sides together. I'm going to repeat this on the other edge as well, just kind of splitting it open. And because you cut into the main panels, you can easily go around those corners. So now I'm going to sew along each one of these short edges at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. We're going to go from, once again, marked 1/2 inch corner to 1/2 inch corner, so you're just stopping before you get to the very edge. You can also just use the previous stitches where they start and stop as your guidelines. Just stop and start at those stitching. Don't go past them. So now when you look at the bottom of the base panel on the wrong side, you should notice your stitching makes a perfect rectangle inside the base panel, all of it a 1/2 inch away from every edge and every corner. Okay, so I'm gonna clip the corners just a tiny bit, pretty much just the corners of the base panel. I'm not really clipping into the main panel, but just a little bit to help reduce the bulk. Now we're going to gently turn the bag right side out. This will give you a good idea what your finished bag is gonna look like. How cool is this looking? It's such a unique play on a bag because a lot of times our main seams would be at the corners, right? But this time the main seams are at the front and the sides. It's a kind of like a boxed bag, but also kind of like a gusset. It's such a cool idea, and the bag it looks so stinking cool, doesn't it? Okay, you can set this to the side. So now we're gonna build the lining panels, and then we're going to add the pockets after we build the lining panels. So take your 2 lining panels, and those are not mirrored. Find 2 that are mirrored and bring them long edges together. Flip right sides together, grab some clips, and clip along the long edge. Repeat this with your other lining combo, making sure we're just focusing on the 2 long edges, not the shorter sides. So now let's go to the sewing machine and sew along each of these clipped edges at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitching at the beginning and the end. Once you have those sewn, press that seam allowance open, and you can iron this if you'd like to hold it open. But with the seam allowance pressed open, we're going to take these back to the sewing machine, and we're going to top stitch along each side of the seam at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Do this for both of your panels. So here are your 2 lining panels, and now we're going to combine them to create one big one, and then we're going to do the pockets. So take your 2 panels, lay them right sides together, pick one edge to work on, and line it up corner to corner, edge to edge, and clip right sides together. And now sew along this edge at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitching at the beginning and the end. And just like before, you're gonna press open this seam allowance so it's nice and flat, and then take it back to the sewing machine and top stitch along both edges of the seam at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, this is your lining now. It's all one big piece of material. We're gonna set this to the side for just a moment. So now we're gonna work on the zipper pocket. On the wrong side of your zipper lining pocket panel, you're going to mark 1 inch down from the top and draw a horizontal line. Then draw another horizontal line that is 3/8 of an inch below that, and then draw 2 short vertical lines connecting those 2 horizontal lines. Each of these vertical lines is going to be 5/8 of an inch in from the long side edges. So now you have this inner rectangle right here. I would also suggest you mark the midpoint on the top edge of this zipper pocket. And now you're going to take your main lining panel and we're going to be working on the very center seam here. So if you look at the top, it's almost like a set of lips. It's like whoop, and then it pierces down, that little cupid's bow or whatever right in the center. That's the middle of the main panel. I'm going to measure down 2.5 inches from that top edge along that center seam. And I'm gonna lay my zipper pocket right side together with the main lining pocket, lining up the midpoint on the top of my zipper pocket with the midpoint, which is that center seam, and the top edge is 2.5 inches down. Now I'm gonna use this tape here to just hold this pocket in place because when I take this to the sewing machine, I will lose this. So now I'm gonna go to the sewing machine and I'm going to stitch right over this little inner rectangle, going through the zipper panel, going through the lining panel, over that center seam. Use a smaller stitch length, like 2 millimeters. Make sure your needle hits all 4 corners and backstitch at the beginning and the end. So once you have that rectangle stitched, you're gonna draw a midpoint line going all the way along the center between the 2 long edges, and then just draw a couple little triangles so they're diagonals to go from the corner down to that midpoint line. Starting in the middle, I'm going to use a seam ripper to seam rip the zipper pocket and the main lining panel. And then once you get that hole big enough, you can use scissors to just cut along that middle line until you get to the tip of one triangle, and then cut along the diagonal all the way to the corners of your stitching. You're getting as close as you can to the stitching without cutting it, but your scissors, the tip of your scissors should touch the thread but not cut it. Does that make sense? It's kissing it. Okay, once you have that cut, you're going to push in your lining panel, your zipper lining panel, and then flip this over so we're looking at the wrong side, and press this panel open. So you really want to get that seam as flat as possible. If you want to use an iron here, I would suggest doing that. And it's going to be most difficult right in the center where you have that center seam of your lining panel. Just roll it and press it as best as you can. So flip it over to the right side and you should see this nice little rectangle opening. And you can see I just kind of keep massaging the seams to get them the way I want them. A lot of times I'll put a ruler on top of this and then something heavy over it and just let that sit while I work on the next few steps. It helps press it flat. So let's set this to the side for just a moment. So now grab your zipper, and I like to add a little piece of double-sided tape along the top and bottom long edges of the zipper tape. I'm using 1/8 of an inch wide tape for that. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna lay our zipper right side up. When the zipper closes, it's gonna close towards the left. And then we're gonna lay our lining with the opening right over it. So just make sure you center the zipper and you have the same amount of overhang on each side. And then once you're happy with that, I'm gonna flip the lining down. I'm gonna take the paper off the top piece of double-sided tape, and then I'm gonna fold the lining back down and then just tape the top edge of that opening to the zipper. And you wanna make sure that your zipper teeth are centered in that window. Pull your zipper pull up through that opening, fold up the bottom of your lining, and remove the paper from the tape on the bottom edge of the zipper. Fold the lining back down and press this in place. So just give it a good look, pick up the sides. I have a little bit of overhang on the left and not as much overhang on the right, but that's okay. As long as the zipper end isn't really close to the window here on the left or the right, it doesn't matter if it overhangs too much on one side or the other. So now I'm gonna go to the sewing machine. I'm just gonna top stitch outside this rectangle here at an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. I do back stitch at the beginning and the end, and I pull the threads through the back side and tie them off. Okay, so once you have this top stitched in place, your zipper can open and close. We're gonna flip this over so we're looking at the wrong side. And you can see we're looking at the right side of our zipper panel. We're gonna take our zipper panel and fold it up so that the bottom short edge now matches up with the top short edge, and just clip all 3 of these edges together. So So the top bottom combo and then the sides, flatten this out nicely. Now we're gonna flip this over and we're gonna pull the lining out of the way. So let's rotate this. So with the lining out of the way, we're gonna sew along the side and the top and the other side at around a 1/2 inch seam allowance. If you feel like you need to do a 3/8 or a 1/4 inch seam allowance, that's fine too. It doesn't really matter over here. You just wanna make sure you're completely closing the sides and the top edge and you're not sewing the main lining panel into any of this. This is only the zipper pocket. Backstitch at the beginning and the end. Okay, before we move on to the next step, just do this for me. Take the bottom of that zipper pocket, pull it up, and clip it to the top of your lining because the pattern has bold letters everywhere warning you. And I still made the mistake on the last bag of sewing this zipper pocket into the next pocket. So just clip it out of the way and set this to the side. Now grab your 2 slip pocket panels. You're gonna lay them right sides together, matching up all 4 edges. And this slip pocket is completely optional if you don't want to make a slip pocket. I mean, you don't have to. You don't have to make a zipper pocket either. But a zipper pocket's always good in a bag. You know, it's a good place to put your keys or like your hand sanitizer and your chapstick. Things that you don't really want floating around on the bottom of your bag. So I'm just clipping around all 4 edges here. Now I measured and marked a 3-inch opening on the bottom edge of my slip pocket. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna sew along all the edges at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, except between those 2 marks. At one of those marks is where I'm gonna start. I'm gonna backstitch, go around all the other 3 edges, and then I'm gonna stop at the other mark and backstitch. So now, after you have that sewn, I'm gonna trim the seam allowance down everywhere except the opening. So I'm just gonna cut the seam allowance in half. And you could have just sewn this at a 1/4 inch seam allowance if you'd like. That's fine too. And then on the corners, I'm gonna cut those down and then kind of like shave off the edges next to each cut. So I do 45 degrees and then I just kind of like veer it down. So it's not like such a sharp angle. It's like a soft kind of rounded angle. I just feel like it makes the corners look a little bit crisper. I don't know, maybe it doesn't. So now I'm going to flip this slip pocket so it's right side out. And I'll take a turning tool to really help poke out those corners. Be gentle with this. With lighter material, it's really easy to accidentally poke a hole in the corners. So always use your fingers first. Okay, so now we want to flatten this out. So tuck in those raw edges on the bottom. And you can use tape to tape that closed if you'd like, or you can just press it down. And do your best to get these seams as straight as you can. So we're going to focus on the top edge first. I'm just going to use some clips here. And I'm going to top stitch along this top edge at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitching at the beginning and the end. Okay, so now grab your main lining panel and we're going to measure 1 inch down from the bottom of the zipper. It can be from the very edge of the material or from the top stitching, whatever's easiest for you. And I'm gonna just mark the midpoint on the top edge of my pocket here with an air erasing marker. It's very difficult to see on this purple material, but I can see it well enough. So what we wanna do now is we want to tape this slip pocket 1 inch below the zipper and centered. So however you wanna do this. You can use pins, especially if you're using a quilt cotton, that's totally fine. You can use tape here. Some people are gonna just eyeball it. That's very impressive. And now we're going to stitch this pocket in place. I know it's hard to see. Most important, make sure that zipper pocket is clipped out of the way. It's not behind your slip pocket. And we're going to top stitch along the sides and the bottom edge, all at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once again, we're gonna do the little triangles on the top corners to really reinforce them. Backstitch at the beginning and the end, and you can tie off the threads on the back if you feel like that helps. All right, once you have your pocket top stitched on, then you can remove the clips from the zipper pocket. So now you see you have slip pocket, zipper pocket. Isn't that cute? Now before I move on, I'm gonna attach my bag tag. So I'm using this little sew on tag here. I'm just gonna add a piece of double-sided tape to the back of it. And I'm going to center this right over my zipper, so above all the pockets, by about 1/2 of an inch. Don't let it get too close to that top edge because we are gonna have a pretty big seam allowance up there. And now I'm just gonna go top stitch around all 4 edges of my tag at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, pulling the threads to the back and the end and tying them off. Okay, all the interior pocket stuff is done, so now we just need to finish up the lining panel just like we did the exterior. I'll walk you through it once again. So we're going to take the two outer edges of our big lining panel here, and we're going to fold them right sides together and clip along this edge, lining it up corner to corner. And now sew along this clipped edge at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitching at the beginning and the end. Now flatten that seam as much as you can from the wrong side. And then just like with the exterior, we're going to create like a tube, and we're going to top stitch along both edges of this seam at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once again, making sure you're just really shoving the lining out of the way as you go. I'll do my best to show you how I do that. I always find it's hardest to sew the first one, easiest to sew the second side of the seam. All right, so now your lining is like a nice big tube. And then you're going to grab your base lining panel, mark the midpoints on the two long edges, flip this over. And once again, on the 4 corners, I just marked little 1/2 inch boxes. Those are my guidelines for stitching. So make sure you're working on the main edges. So I'm going to turn my lining unit so that the zipper is facing wrong side up. And then I'm just going to flip up the bottom edge of my lining panel. Take my base lining panel and hold these two right sides together, matching up the midpoint of the base panel with that center seam on my lining panels. And I'm just going to clip along this edge, right sides together. So now flip this over. So you're looking at the back of the base panel, and we're going to stitch this base panel in place at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, starting and stopping at those 1/2 inch squares, back stitch at the beginning and the end. All right, once you have one edge sewn, pull out the base panel, line it up with the other side of your lining main panel. It's so hard to say like front, back, sides, because it's all rearranged, you know, but you should be able to clearly tell where you're gonna line this up. So midpoint of the long edge of your base panel lines up with that center seam, clip together, flip this over so the base panel is wrong side up. On this edge though, make sure you leave about a 6 inch opening centered on this long edge and backstitch around it. Don't sew through it. At a 1/2 inch seam allowance, starting and stopping at those marked corners and backstitching at the beginning and the end. Okay, so now before we do the sides, we have to cut into the main lining. So you're gonna pull the base panel away. Pull the base panel down and away, and I'm looking at the stitching on my lining, and I'm just looking at that 1/2 inch stitching I just made, and I'm gonna cut right up from the bottom edge up to the beginning and ending of the stitching. Just right in there on both sides. Once again, making sure you're not cutting through the base panel. You're only cutting through the main panel. So just push the base panel out of the way with your thumb while you cut up. And then you can tug your fingers into one short edge, pull, and the lining spreads really nicely right around those corners. I love that method. It's one of my favorite. I don't know what it's called. It's kind of like boxing a corner. I'm not sure if there's like a technical name for this technique, but it is one of my favorites. It gives the sharpest corners in the end that are absolutely perfect. So now, once again, we're going to sew this with the base facing wrong side up, stitch at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, just connecting stitch to stitch, back stitch at the beginning and the end. So I wanted to show you, you probably saw, I forgot to leave the opening on one of these bottom edges. I was so excited about finishing up this bag. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take the long edge of my base panel here. That's on the side that doesn't have the zipper pocket. So just over here. And I'm going to use my ruler and I'm gonna mark 6 inch opening. So 6 inch opening, just like that. Now this is how I fix this. I do this all the time where I forget to leave an opening. So this is how I fix this problem. What I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna go to the sewing machine and I'm going to just do a short, like 1 inch long stitch, back stitching really well, just outside of each one of these marks. So I'm just gonna go right over my previous stitching, just making a really firm back stitching blob on each outer edge of these marks. Okay, so can you see how it's like a little bit thicker in those spots? And then I just seam rip. So unfortunately there's no way to get around seam ripping. So I usually can just get the seam ripping kind of started right there. And then with the the little ball end of the seam ripper, I push that inside, the pokey part facing up. And you can just kind of rip right along the stitching. I'm not ripping the material, I'm only ripping the stitching until I get to that other mark. So I get close to that, there we go. It's pretty quick. And then I'll just make sure I trim down all these little loose threads really well so that they don't poke out in the end. So there we go. I made the mistake, but easy fix. So now I have that opening in the bottom and it is secure. It's nice. I don't have to worry about it ripping when I turn the bag out. So now we need to install the magnetic snaps, and these are going to be on the lining portion, so it's easier just to work from the back. So we're going to look at the wrong side of our lining panel, like the back or front panel, not the sides. We're going to measure 1.5 inches down from the top edge, and then you can just make a little center mark right there on the seam. So the goal here is to not cut any threads, okay? So I have a little dot marked right on the center seam. Just because that's where the dot is doesn't mean that I'm going to be cutting anything there. Because my washer here has a circle in the center of it, I'm going to lay that circle right over that dot, and then I'm going to mark in the little slits for the prongs. And now they are going to get close to my top stitching, but they are not going to cut. They're not going to go over my top stitching. So just like I did with my bag tag, I'm going to use a little extra scrap piece of the wax canvas as a stabilizer. So I'm going to mark those same slit marks on that. Then I'm going to take my seam ripper and very gently seam rip through those marks. And it's better if it's smaller than you marked rather than bigger. You want a tight fit here. I'm going to do the same thing on the scrap material. And now this is going to go with the front panel. I'm going to use the male snap for that. So on the right side of the material, looking at the right side, I'm going to find those slits and I'm going to insert the prongs of my male snap into those slits. So you see snap is on the right side of the bag, slits come through the back. Then I'll grab my scrap piece of wax canvas, insert that, then my washer, and then you can push these open or in on themselves, whichever one is easier. I find that these are always difficult, so I take like the end of one of my tools and just push it down over the metal prongs, and that flattens it out nicely. You want it to be as flat as possible because you don't want this rubbing against your wax canvas all the time. And then I'm going to grab a piece of my duct tape, and I might actually do 2 pieces of duct tape because this will be rubbing against that wax canvas. There we go. And there we go, 1 snap installed. So you're going to repeat that on the other side. I'm going to install the female snap on what I'm considering is the back panel. Exact same placement, exact same method. And there we go. We have both of our magnetic snaps installed, and that's your closure for the bag. So now let's finish this cutie up. We're going to insert the exterior right sides together with the lining. So the exterior is going to go into the lining. I am going to have the zipper panel be the back of the bag. So I'm going to flip this around so that the lining side that has a zipper panel is going to go right sides together with what I'm considering the back side of my bag. We're just going to shove this in there. Now, because we have all 4 seams, it makes it really easy to line everything up on the top. The first thing you want to do though is find those D-rings and push them down. You do not want to sew over those, so push them down. And then match up each of the 4 seams and clip these right sides together. This should be very easy to do. And luckily all of our seams are already spread open, so we don't even have to worry about the bulk. And then just go around this top edge, clipping it all together. It should fit perfectly. All right, once you have it all clipped together, we're going to take this to the sewing machine and we're going to sew along the top edge of this bag at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back stitching at the beginning and the end. I like to sew from inside the bag for this part. Just take your time here. Make sure you can always see where the 1/2 inch marker is on your sewing machine because you want to make sure you really get all those curved edges matched up properly. All right, if you're using a thicker material, I would suggest doing a 2nd row of top stitching around that. But if you're using thicker material, this bag would be challenging. So now what I'm going to do is just trim this seam allowance in half. If you have pinking shears, use those. And then wherever you have some curves, I would suggest clipping into the seam allowance just a bit. If you use pinking shears, you don't need to do this, but if you didn't, then just a little bit of clips to help this spread will be helpful. So now find that hole that you left in the lining and gently pull the exterior and the bag through that hole so it's all right side out. Once you have everything pulled out, push the lining into the bag. And now we want to focus on this top seam. So I like to keep the hole in the lining so I could reach my hand inside and push my fingers from the back of this seam up so I can really get it wrapped around the way I want it. And I always suggest looking from the exterior while you do this because it's really easy to accidentally have the lining kind of folded up a little bit higher than the exterior. And usually we would like the exterior to be folded more up than the lining, you know? So we're just gonna go around this entire top edge, rolling and pressing that seam so we can get it nice and flat. So once you have this top edge rolled out and flattened, now we need to top stitch around it. So I like to always start on one of the corner seams. I just feel like it hides it a little bit better if my beginning and ending is a little wonky. But we're gonna top stitch at an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance around the entire top edge. I like to take the bed off of my machine so that I can just wrap this around the bottom of the machine and top stitch it. If you can't do that and you struggle with this, you can always turn this so it's lining side out and then top stitch from the inside. Or you can top stitch from the lining side, just know that your bobbin thread is what you're gonna see on the exterior of the bag. I suggest back stitching at the beginning and the end. So the pattern suggests doing another row of top stitching that's a 1/4 inch below this one. I will be honest with you, there's no way I'm gonna make that look good. Like my skill set's not there. It's gonna look so wonky if I do that. So I'm not going to do that. I'm gonna leave it with just one. But I am going to now pull the lining out, find that hole that we left in the bottom, and then just straighten out that seam. Put your fingers in the seam, push the raw edge in, and then clip along this edge with the raw bits tucked inside so it's nice and clean. And now top stitch along this clipped edge at an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitching at the beginning and the end. So tuck your lining back in the bag. Oh, isn't she pretty? And then grab your strap and attach it to the top of your bag. And how stinking cute is this bag? I just love it. So the last thing I'm gonna do is attach a rivet on each side. And now these are not necessary, but they do provide a little bit of extra reinforcement. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna attach a rivet on the top part of this triangle. So I'm just gonna center my marking for this. And it's gonna go through the D-ring tab and through the strap tab and through the entire bag. So you see I can just put in my hole punch here, and it's also going through the lining. It's going through everything. And then just pop in my rivet. And you see, you could do 2 if you wanted. If you want to make this look nice, you could do another rivet below it. You could do 4 rivets. I find 1 is fine. So I'm just going to insert that. I'm gonna grab my press and just press this in place. And there we go. Nice little detail. So I'm gonna do the same thing on the other side. And there we go. Bag is done. It looks so pretty, doesn't it? Like it looks like a simple bag, but she's fancy. I hope you guys love making this one. Okay, what'd you think? I made a couple tweaks just because when you're working with wax canvas, you gotta be careful about some of the thicker seams. We do have some thick seams though, even with my tweaks. So like I said, if these cargo pockets are like, I don't know if my machine can handle that, then just do the slip pockets. It's gonna be a lot easier and it's gonna be a lot thinner. However, if you're up for the challenge, I think you and your machine can handle it. I really do. I think wax canvas is another deceptive type of material where it looks thick, it looks difficult to work with, but it's actually not very difficult. You just have to kind of mush it up a little bit. If you make the other sides of this, I would love to see it. And if you have some fun with the materials, let me know. That's the fun thing about these subscription boxes is that every month you get all kinds of material. And maybe one month you're like, I don't know if I'm really feeling that pattern. I don't know if I really want to make it this month, or I got a lot going on. You can use your material from other months for future patterns. So if you do that, please make sure you tag me because I love seeing how creative you guys are with this. I never have enough of the material from previous boxes to do that, but I would like to. I hope you're having a great day. Have a fantastic rest of your week. Get out there and make something. Bye guys.